rasti u jaslama dječjim, rasti i cvjetaj zemljo radnih ljudi, i neka mir nad tvojim ljudima vlada, mir tvojim lađama napuči i tvome danu što se vedar budi. Rasti sretna da svi narodi vide, sa strana svih, sa juga i sjevera, kako se rađa i kako se voli, kako se brani zemlja proletera. Rasti cvjetaj pod zvijezdom slobode, pod rukom partije i pod srcem Tita. Rasti cvjetaj pod zvijezdom slobode, pod rukom partije i pod srcem Tita. Sreći u vodi i u zraku, i u sjaju žita. Rasti i cvjetaj pod zvijezdom slobode i pod srcem Tita. Rasti i cvjetaj pod zvijezdom slobode.
มาแผ่นที่ดินแดนแห่งนี้สู้ที่ลำพาเรือหน้าลมในท่าแดงตัวแรงร้อนเสียสละสู่สันตาแผ่ไทยเกตอดไว้ดีรักษาศักดิ์ศรีเวลาสามีไปในทั่วแดนลาวสุนายาเรสุนายา
век проходит, как хозяин необъятной родины своей. Тут жизнь невольна и широка, точно Волга полная течет. Молодым везде у нас дорога, старикам везде у нас почет. Никто у нас не лишний, а заслугам каждый награжден. Золотыми буквами мы пишем всенародный сталинский величие и славу. Никакие годы не сотрут. Человек всегда имеет право на учение, подвиг и на труд. Над страной весенний ветер веет, с каждым днем все радостнее жить. И никто на свете не умеет лучше нас смеяться и любить. Но сурово брови мы насупим, если враг захочет нас сломать. Как небесную родину мы любим, бережем, как ласковую мать.
Good evening, everybody, and welcome along. It is the evening of the 29th of February 2024, and we are coming to you tonight with another live stream. And we have various different things to talk about tonight, including Emmanuel Macron losing the plot and NATO plunging into an ever greater crisis. We have a very interesting briefing from the Russian Ministry of Defense, and the what I'm going to call the unbearable emptiness of Cornel West and Chris Hedges, which is something which will be self-explanatory when I come to it. So let us begin by a bit of a roll call through those of you who are in the chat for tonight. And I will see what issues are being brought up here. So, good evening to Lee Hinchcliffe over there in Sheffield, and CJ, who says, greetings from Richmond, Virginia. Bore witness to yet another breaking of a home today, as a son's father is off to jail for 8 years. Down with the system that degrades men and scars children. So, they carted somebody off to prison in your local area today. Well, I mean, this is the US system in action, so to say. I'm sure that I don't know whether that man was carted off to jail under a sentencing scheme approved of by Joe Biden, but certainly it would seem likely. The prison system in the USA is indeed much more extensive than it is even in Britain, which has some very repressive laws, and we may cover later on that they are getting more repressive all the time. But the vast expansion of the US prison system in the 70s, 80s, and 90s bears closer examination. In fact, the drive for ever greater sentences and ever greater numbers of people being imprisoned pretty much set the tone for the rest of the imperialist bloc to follow. So it's probably worth a whole episode devoted to that expansion. And of course, Biden's role within it being important, but by no means the only one. Red Star Betty, good evening to you up there in Durham. Have you expanded the borders of the People's Republic yet, comrade? President Jesus says, hello, I saw the 1993 movie Naked last night. That's a Mike Leigh movie, in case anybody's wondering. But the guy that directed Secrets and Lies, the film that was nominated for quite a few Oscars, I think, back in about 1997, and he also directed recently the film, a very good film version of the what's known as the Peterloo Massacre, or the Massacre at St. Peter's Field, which of course is a Mancunian event and took place in 1819. And Mike Leigh, being a Greater Manchester filmmaker, it's very important to say that he's actually from Salford, which is the city on the other side of the river from Manchester. And Salfordians get very upset if we, over in the Manchester side of things, claim all of Greater Manchester as our own. Long story. I'm sure there are analogous examples in the United States. So President Jesus completes his comment, so that's how you people from Manchester roll. Well, we can't all be as glamorous as David Thewlis in that particular role. But in my defence, the movie opens in Manchester, and he spends most of his time in London and ends up, if I remember the plot of this correctly, because it's a long time since I've seen it, he ends up facing off against some upper-class psychopath in London. Brilliant role from David Thewlis, one of our great actors from the great English Northwest. Americans may have seen him in one of the better seasons of that Fargo TV series. I think it was season 3, with Thewlis playing the sort of principal antagonist, and Ewan McGregor playing a dual role as twins in that one. Tim Gray says, good evening, comrades from the land of the dead, more commonly known as England. Come on now, Tim. There's it may be dead at the moment in the bourgeois sense, but the proletariat will reinvigorate things in the end. I know what you mean, though. Raziel, who says, good evening from the fishing town of Leigh-on-Sea. Are you down near Southend then, if I've got that right? Fenrir, good evening to you. Scott M, good evening. Jay, good evening to you. Albert, good evening to you. Lucas says, evening from the West Midlands of perfidious Albion. Well, we are packing them in from the English regions tonight. Rob A, good evening to you. I believe you're over in the wrong side of the Pennines, of course. The regional rivalries are getting worse. Martin, good afternoon to you out there in Georgia, I believe. And DE, who says, evening from an enclave known as Hampshire. Will there be a People's Republic of Hampshire, comrade? You have to answer that question. Otis, who says, good evening. And Guy, who says, at my first school work involving NATO, I described it as defensive. Well, we all make mistakes in our youth, comrade. It's the propaganda that we grow up with. Congratulations and thank you to CJ for becoming a hero of socialist labour, which is a Patreon level you can reach. And thank you to all of you who support the programme either on Patreon or through the Buy Me a Coffee link. Your support is what's enabled this programme that we do to evolve from from podcast form and into the YouTube show it is now. So thank you to CJ and everybody else who's supported it over the years. Joseph George, who says, red salute from Austin, Texas. Good to have somebody from the Lone Star State here with us. Heidi, good evening to you. Ogham the Bold says, I issued Andy Burnham's Grove Company with an SAR for blacklisting. Now that does sound interesting, Ogham the Bold. If you don't know who Andy Burnham is our beloved mayor of Greater Manchester. So if his public company, I presume it must be a public company, is involved in blacklisting Ogham the Bold, I would love, if you can provide more details, to hear more about that. I'm going to put in the email address. If you want to divulge any information about that particular incident, just go on to editor@marksengelsinstitute.org. I promise secrecy. Right. Okay, well, if Otis, if you want the soundtrack selection, I am sending out CDs this week. Bilbo, say hello to you down there in Portsmouth. Luther says no to NATO, quite correctly. Good evening to Peter out in the wilds of the greater perfidious Albion. Beju, good evening to you. Irish Partisan, good evening to you, our comrade out there in Minsk. Tobias, good evening to you. James Graham, who joins us. And C. Bolt. Albert says, the USA holds 25% of the world's prison population. Most of them are non-white. That's another legacy of Joe Biden right there, but also, to be fair, Richard Nixon, Ronald Reagan, and various others. Yu Wan joins us and says, top detention centres in the world are American firms used to work for the #1 firm in the world. Oz, good evening to you. Irish Partisan says, things are tense in my neck of the woods. 90,000 NATO troops on manoeuvres near the Belarusian border as part of the NATO Operation Steadfast Defender. French troops in Ukraine soon. I doubt it for reasons that I will go on to explain. Clavet, good evening to you. Fenrir says, went to Manchester once in the 90s. The music scene was fantastic at that time. Not anymore. I don't think so anyway. Rob says, someday a British Uncle Joe will smooth the Pennines away. Hey, with a mighty swipe of his hand, Rob, you know, or at least build a canal over it. All right. Be sure to like and share the stream if you haven't done so already. And we are, of course, live on Odyssey and on Rumble and on YouTube. If there is particular enthusiasm for me doing this live streamed to Twitter, then I will do so. So I'm just going to drop the link to the YouTube stream on various different places. Any questions that you've got that you want me to address on the stream tonight, do feel free to pop them in. I'm going to go through the opening remarks that I've got, and then I'll get to the questions later on. Try and structure the conversation a little bit. Right. So let's get to the main event then, which is, of course, the aforementioned Emmanuel Macron, mentioned by myself and in passing, and also the French role by Irish Partisan, losing his shit in a spectacular fashion and threatening that French troops or European Union troops might have to be deployed in Ukraine because they can't have the Russians win, usual stuff, etc., etc. together with, as Irish partisans mentioned, the 90,000 troops doing manoeuvres in Eastern Europe, as has been reported. I mean, there is talk that this is the biggest individual exercise mounted by NATO since 1989, possibly earlier than that. I have said before that I have my doubts about the actual size of the NATO contingent, mainly because all of the European armies are so much more diminished than they were back in the late 80s, when the British Army in the late 80s had at least 100-odd thousand combat capable soldiers, at least. The French army was considerably bigger, as was the old Bundeswehr of West Germany, and they've all diminished in size since then. I mean, I know they've added the various contingents from the Eastern European, well, colonies, essentially, because that's what's happened to Eastern Europe. It has been colonized. But I don't think that they can get at 90,000 men into the field at one time. I think what they're doing is they're counting all of the troops that will take part, plus all of the associated office staff and every other person they can find that they can possibly tack onto that total. So 90,000, I don't think, is the number of men in the field. Now, if there's people who have different information about that there is going to be definitively 90,000 NATO troops deployed in Eastern Europe, then feel free to send it in. But I doubt that it's 90,000. Needless to say, it's still going to be large-scale manoeuvres. And this has led to, together with Macron's outburst about French troops or a European task force being put into Ukraine, the people are getting the idea that there's somehow going to be some kind of intervention here. Macron was, of course, talking out of his rear end, as he often does, and even Olaf Scholz and even David Cameron, the man who really runs the British government, because it ain't Rishi, had to come out and say that they weren't endorsing Macron's words, because David Cameron is just about smart enough to know that there's no possible way that he could get away with that, that either the Tories or the Labour Party could get away with that, that the British armed forces couldn't sustain the kind of war with the Russians that would necessitate. I have said before, and I will repeat it now, the only way that the NATO forces enter Ukraine will be to enter Western Ukraine at the end of the combat operations that the Russians have in mind, at the end of Russian territorial acquisitions. Only then, via a non-official or tacit agreement with the Russians, will any NATO forces enter into the rump of Western Ukraine. That is what will happen in the end. And they will enter into it, and then the Russians, I think, will essentially leave Western Ukraine to be, again, poison in the veins of the EU and NATO. They're not going to be sending a French task force to Odessa. This isn't 1919. This isn't Britain and France and the other European powers are not in a position to send armies of intervention against the Russian armed forces now. They couldn't sustain it. If the French got themselves in a shooting war with the Russians, they'd do about as well as the British, which is not very well at all. And the French generals probably know that. The British generals know that, which is why the British backed away from it immediately. So why is Macron spitting his dummy out, is the question. Well, Macron is throwing a fit because he has come to realise that things are falling apart very badly for him. Not only is he facing severe domestic revolts again, in this time in the form of the small to medium-sized landowners, the farmers, who are having a go at him. Of course, there's a militant tradition amongst sections of the French landowners that goes back a long way. The small farmers of France do have a militant left to them, going back to José Bové with the anti-globalization stuff of the ATTAC organization in the early 2000s. But there's also a right-wing side of it, also a sort of more reactionary side of it. But all of the small to medium landowners in France, the small to medium farmers, are of course under pressure from the withdrawal of subsidies, the decline of profitability. They're being outcompeted by agribusiness. Same in Germany, same in Poland, same in Italy, same in Romania. That's where all of these protests have been popping up. So he's under a lot of pressure there. He's also now the French president who has been overseeing the final decline and fall of the neo-colonial system established by Charles de Gaulle in the late 50s, early 60s in places like Mali, Niger, Burkina Faso, Guinea, to name the four candidates that are four candidates for the leadership of the sort of anti-imperialist movement in West Africa, with particularly Niger and Mali and Burkina Faso being the more advanced and militant of these, with Ibrahim Traoré in Burkina Faso very much laying claim to the mantle that of Thomas Sankara. So Macron has lost access, or is losing access, to Nigerian uranium, to Burkinabe gold mines. Bit by bit, the revolutionary nationalist organizations there move to secure control over the very profitable natural resources in these countries. So Macron is the man who lost the French neo-colonies. And if you look at how France has set up its neo-colonial system, it's done in a way that sought to preserve essentially a French empire for far longer than the nominal independence of these countries would give you the idea of it being in existence for. See, for instance, I didn't understand or know much about the CFA franc zone until relatively recently, and the fact that the French central bank, and through them now the European Central Bank, were the ones that were able to essentially control the monetary systems of the countries that joined the CFA franc zone, including all, of course, of the former French colonies, that the French imperialists exercised influence along with the British over their former colonial possessions through organizations such as ECOWAS. So it's a very comprehensive and neo-colonial system that was, of course, first theorized and researched properly by Kwame Nkrumah. So the loss of these colonies to French imperialism is going to be long-term devastating. The loss of the ability to extract cheap uranium from Niger, the loss of the ability to exploit gold mines, diamond mines, and ultimately oil concessions in a lot of these countries, is going to really put a hole in the profits of the French ruling class. And so Macron is incredibly bitter about that. He's probably going to be being given an incredibly hard time by various French capitalists who are losing out on business now that the regimes in the juntas in these countries are more secure and are carrying out more radical action in terms of nationalisation of key industries, either demanding better terms from the French companies, which of course the French companies don't want to give them, because the whole reason why they're doing business in Niger or Mali or Burkina Faso or the Central African Republic is because they can hyper-exploit both the labour and the resources that are there, and to create the super profits that French imperialism needs. And French capitalism domestically has been on the decline for many, many decades, as you can tell from the successive waves of attacks that they've carried out upon the French working class. So, Macron is obviously feeling rather bitter about all of this. The involvement of the Kremlin in the revolts in West Africa has been tangential at best, but he, like many other European politicians, has found a focus for his rage and his failures, and it's blaming the Russians for it all. So that's part of his motivation in not wanting to give up the ghost in Ukraine. But also it's because they have realized, the Europeans that is, that they are as much invested in the downfall of Putin and the Putin system as the Americans are, maybe even more so, because for all the decline of American imperialism, there is still, of course, gigantic amounts of capital inside the imperial core in the United States that are moved in and out of the imperial core. But also there is still even in a diminished state, a more comprehensive industrial base inside the United States than there is in most of the Western European countries, including France, even with all the diminishing that's gone on there over the last 50 years. So the US, despite its deterioration in its status and its loss of leading economy in the world status, arguably to the Chinese a number of years ago, still has the ability to, well, generate profits for its capitalist class via its much more extensive imperial reach, and also it has more of an ability to generate profit internally for its domestic capitalist class than the French capitalists do. So what you're seeing is the flailing impotence of a French Fifth Republic, which is going down the tubes. And they are desperate for the project in Ukraine to pay off. And the payoff, of course, would be the internal collapse of the Russian Federation and the imposition of a comprador regime. That's not going to happen. That ship sailed a long, long time ago. It was probably the last chance they had to do that was before Putin came along. Since then, all of their attempts to carry out colour revolutions and destabilization campaigns, if anything, all they've done is managed to make they've pushed the Putin system in a more radical direction by their constant hostility. But now this is the end. And to go back to something I've repeated before, I've said on multiple occasions before, to understand why the European Union and the major countries behind it are so desperate and in such a flailing and weakened condition now, you have to understand that post World War II, these countries were set up again by American imperialism in order to restore capitalism to act as part of the American bloc. But they were set up in such a way as to never be able to, again, pose a threat to the vital interests of American imperialism. And also that their imperial interests, that of Britain, France, what was West Germany, Italy, etc. You can also add in Netherlands and Spain, who still have some role in the imperialist system, especially the Netherlands. They were set up in order to be just powerful enough to be able to sustain capitalism internally and to stave off the threats of a potential worker-led revolution, but to never to be able to return to the level of power they previously had, where they could impinge upon US interests. And this was, of course, something which, again, is the Soviets understood very well in the late 40s. It was kind of lost in the revisionist period. And the illusion of Europe as a counterpoint or a potential other source of power in the world to another pole to the United States, that illusion was very strong and was, of course, fueled in part by the Anglo-European left, particularly the Social Democrats, and of course was something that the Khrushchevite revisionists indulged as well. The idea that Europe was this potentially independent pole of power that would swing away from the United States if only the revisionists could offer the Europeans enough concessions. This turned out to be, of course, an absolutely deluded point of view. The foundation upon which the new states of France, Germany, etc., Italy, Spain to a certain extent, were founded, the foundation for them, especially the ones that had been ruined in World War II, was set up by the United States. They remain tied to the United States because, of course, as the increasing impotence of French imperialism shows, without US military and economic backing, the ability of any of these countries to sustain themselves as imperialist powers disappears. De Gaulle, of course, having been an ally of the United States in the later 50s and early 60s, tried to make a go of France as a sort of independent pole in the world. Didn't work, so he invested heavily in European unity with the idea being that would enable France to shape a wider Europe. And of course, that didn't work either, because, of course, France and West Germany, as it was, and the other European countries that were in the old European Economic Community, which became the EU, were, of course, again, diminishing all the time. And why are they diminishing? Well, they're diminishing because, as we've covered many times before, their ability to make profits internally from the internal to their own borders exploitation of the domestic working class, that ability was always declining, goes over the edge after the period sort of 65 to 75 ends that economic revival that followed World War II. And ever since then, the domestic working class in France has been pushed back and back and back by every French government since Mitterrand. Of course, there's been a lot of resistance, but the concessions that were quite extensive at one stage that had been made to the French working class had now largely vanished. France is well on the road to being another Britain, which is one that is even more deindustrialized and where the balance of the workforce tilts more in favor of those involved in what Marx described as unproductive labor, so service sector, etc. Those working outside of the commodity production process. So this is the road that France is on. It's also the road that Germany has been on, as I've said many times before, for a long time now. Deindustrialization in Germany did not just spring out of the ground it was not created by the sanctions on Russia and the cutting off of Russian oil and gas to Germany. It's been going on for quite some time, and the German firms have been sending jobs over to the east, over to China in particular, but also been automating them away. So there's that, and there's that economic weakness that's been there for a while, and also the inbuilt political problem that comes from when your state was refounded by US imperialism after World War II. It creates a fundamental weakness to go along with the enduring economic decline. And so what you have now is that there was all these delusions in the 90s that Europe was going to be this new independent player balancing between the East and the West. And of course, it has just turned into a complete slave of US interests, because without the US, there is no Europe. Without the US, there is no European Union. Without US backing, there is no ability of these sort of smaller and diminished imperial powers to defend their territory anymore. And because the US didn't move to try to assist the French imperialists in re-establishing themselves thus far, we're still, the US could still decide it wanted to do something nasty in Western Africa. We've yet to see. But so far, the US hasn't moved that much in terms of going after the revolutionary nationalist regimes in Burkina Faso, Mali, or Niger. And the French were revealed as being completely impotent. They couldn't do anything to defend these long-term neo-colonial possessions, to defend their role there, to defend the profits they make there. In the end, they were powerless to stop the takeover by the radical nationalist army officers. So Macron stands as the naked emperor, basically. All of the CFA franc zone peoples, the people that the French have continued to hyper-exploit for another 60 years after the empire formally came to a close, can all see how weakened the French regime is, and that they were unable to stop their influence being severely eroded in these other countries, which means that there's going to be more trouble ahead for them, that they're going to lose elsewhere. And this is why they're getting desperate. It's why Macron's becoming incredibly irresponsible, because France is even more diminished than Germany is. And he knows that. He knows that very well. He will attempt again, of course, to go on a more full-scale offensive against the French working class. But that's becoming increasingly difficult for him to do, because he already faced a near, semi-insurrectionary situation in the form of the Yellow Vests. He's got severe trouble with the farmers. So there are troubling signs for the French ruling class that it's the long period of France being seen as a big power in the world and being able to act accordingly is coming to a close. And so that's why the petty the petty emperor, the naked emperor Macron, is running around and screaming because it's all over. It's all over for France. It's all over for the European Union. And the European Union was meant to be the continuation of France and French diplomacy and French power via other means. The means being that it would be France that would politically guide the Union and that Germany would provide the economic basis for it. All of that is going because it turned out that the entire thing was dependent upon continued long-term alliances with the United States, which is now got so many problems of its own that its future attitude towards the Ukraine project and its future attitude towards Europe is coming into question. So this is a disaster in closing in upon the European ruling classes, particularly the bigger of them getting increasingly frantic about it. And if they try to turn on the domestic working class in a major way, there will, of course, be a major fight back. And then we may see the re-emergence for real of European fascism. Not the kind that the institutional left in the West gets hysterical about from time to time, but a real version of it. So this is why Macron is losing the plot and going crazy. This is why they're all falling out with each other. The more far-sighted leaders in Europe, such as Fico in Slovakia and Orban in Hungary, can see the writing on the wall. This is why Orban, who's this big-time nationalist reactionary, is a little bit cleverer than most, though, and that's why he's been off making deals with Vietnam, China, Indonesia, and loads of people, loads of governments in the Far East, because he can see that the European project is crashing down, and he's probably just thinking he's going to try and grab what he can out of it before the whole thing hits the buffers. So let's pause there and talk a little bit more to those in the chat. So we have got with us Alan from Oakland, California. Greetings to you. We have got my comrade Jason from the Class Consciousness Project. Be sure to check out the Class Consciousness Project website if you haven't done so already. A new article going up on there tomorrow, I think. So be sure to look at that. I'm just going to post the link in the chat there. And here we go. Comrade Hello Hi, good evening to you. Gonzalo Cabrera, good evening to you. And hello to Slava, who's joined us. DE says they might send an elite team of document shredders. Yes, indeed. Slava asks, do you think there will be another front line opened at Transnistria, given the latest news of their Congress asking Russia for protection? Well, I would say that the Transnistria question is an interesting one, because I read the other day that they'd actually had a referendum where they overwhelmingly voted to join the Russian Federation in 2006, and basically the Russians told them no, or essentially fobbed them off. So they've issued an appeal. I read that they'd issued an appeal for assistance against the Moldovan government, both to this had gone to the Russian Duma, but it had also gone to the OSCE and I think the EU and the UN and that's quite an effective move, because basically it then opens up the debate in all of these organizations and allows everybody to see if any of them will do anything. Of course, the UN will do nothing. The Americans and also the Europeans have plans for Moldova, which will do no good for Moldovans any more than the plans they cooked up for Ukraine have done any good for Ukrainians. Another front at Transnistria. Well, the difficulty's always been that now, and I know that the Transnistrians, or Prednestrovia, I think it's, or the Prednestrovian Moldovan Republic, I think it's called, PMR, has its own army. There's a few thousand Russian peacekeeping forces there guarding that massive ammunition dump. But then again, how do the Russians actually get men in there quickly if it all spirals out of control? It's an interesting one. As to how the inner circle of the Russian government sees it, it's difficult to tell at the moment. we'll have to see what indications come out over the next few days. I mean, the only way that they could rapidly get there, in my view, is if they pushed to the point where the Ukrainian resistance collapsed, and then the Russians were able to quickly send men in via Odessa to link up with Transnistria. And if they did that, then there would be no way that the Europeans could get in there and stage some sort of invasion. Now, I'm told that the Chisanu government of Sandu, the complete hideous bureaucrat who is running Moldova into the ground on behalf of US imperialism, is mobilizing its army. So quite what that will lead to, I don't know, given that they were unable to defeat the rebellion in the early 90s, and I doubt that the quality of the Moldovan army has got particularly better in the last 30 years. So, and will the Ukrainians, will the Kiev regime try something down there? There'll be those who think that they can. So, going to be very interesting. I mean, from what I could tell from the Russian Ministry of Defense briefing and other news that's come from the front line, certainly the Russians are speeding up in terms of their acquisition of territory in Donetsk and other areas around it. But whether the Russians are ready to go for a full-scale push across either into Odessa, what they might have to go in via the sea, or a push down the coast through Nikolaev to Odessa and then go to Transnistria. I mean, I'm just not seeing at the moment how this can be done quickly if indeed the Moldovans, backed up by possibly the Romanians, have decided to do something incredibly stupid with Transnistria. So that for that one, I'll have to say we'll have to wait and see. I mean, it's certainly a possibility, but I'm going to put that down for something I have to come back to, basically, because my honest answer to you, Slava, is it really does depend if there is... Has this move that the Transnistrians have done, has it been coordinated in advance with the Russians? I imagine it must have been, because the Russians have an extensive... Well, they have Russian forces on the ground there, so there must be coordination between the Russian government and the Transnistrian authorities. So if they're going to issue this call for essentially to enact the 2006 referendum and be taken into the Russian Federation, there must have been a coordinated move done with the Russian government, and they must know the results of whatever the Duma is going to say yes to them before they issued this call, and that the OSCE, the EU, and the UN aren't going to do jack shit. So maybe this is part of a wider plan. Maybe the Russians do have a plan for a generalized offensive that will push to Odessa. Maybe they're feeling confident that the Ukrainian army and its NATO assistance are diminished to the point where if they do go on some kind of offensive, maybe in later March or April, that they can push all the way to Odessa and into Transnistria, and NATO won't have time to pull their pants up. Again, we'll have to see. But I'm assuming that there has been a level of coordination done here between Transnistria and the Russian authorities, and we'll see in the next few days if that's given how the Duma responds to it. I assume it will be responding favourably, given it's been a long-standing consensus between everybody from Zhirinovsky's gang to the KPRF to, well, now United Russia, that Transnistria should be admitted to the Russian Federation. So we'll have to see how that goes. Hello to Dan Kovalik, who's enjoying the programme. Good to have you with us. HM says, thoughts on the spiralling flat tax on cigarettes. Leftists celebrate it because smoking is bad. Seems like another kick in the teeth for the working class. The left is AWOL on this. I honestly hadn't noticed. I mean, I quit, how long ago now? 10 years ago. Went back to it periodically, like on, off and on when I was particularly drunk after that. But I haven't bought a packet for many, many years. But even then it was getting very expensive to buy cigarettes in Britain. Yeah, I mean, massive duties imposed on cigarettes and alcohol are essentially an assault on the working class. I mean, one thing I was thinking of, and I was discussing this with comrades recently, was that there needs to be a much better communist analysis of the taxation system. Because one of the things that, again, the ruling class has done over the last 40, 50 years is to talk about how, taxation is bad and we need to move to a low tax society, etc. But of course, this is always a deception. What they mean is low tax for them and pass the tax burden on to the working class however they can, if not in the form of direct taxation, i.e. payroll taxes, income tax, etc. Then sales taxes, in our country we call it value-added tax, VAT, which is a 20% tax on most consumer products with some exclusions, duties on cigarettes and alcohol, etc. All of which, of course, hits the working class in the pocket. And, of course, because essentially the entire left in Britain and in the United States as well, with a few exceptions, are essentially all social democrats. Some posture as Trotskyites and permanent revolutionaries or something, but they're all social democrats. So they all come up with the same slogan, which is tax the rich. And they wonder why it doesn't really catch on with the working class. And it doesn't really catch on with the working class because the working class knows very well that the rich can find 1,000 ways to avoid tax, whereas they, and to be fair, the lower petty bourgeois as well, will get absolutely hammered by revenue and customs. That's the tax agency in our country, or the tax agency in the United States. They will go after a working class person for failing to declare a certain bit of income, or a lower end petty bourgeois small business guy for not doing his taxes properly. But they will, of course, ignore the gigantic tax evasion schemes of rich individuals, individual bourgeois, or the corporations who employ the big accountancy firms to make sure that they pay the minimal amount of tax possible. So whether it's in Britain or the United States, some leftist going around saying tax the rich, well, it's not the case that the workers who don't believe that or don't buy into it or oppose it think that they're going to be rich someday. It's just that they have an understanding that the rich will always evade it, and the government's tax burden always falls on them. So going around and advocating for high taxation under this current system doesn't endear you to the class at all. In fact, most working class people, if you sat them down and asked them about whether the rich should keep their undeserved wealth that they've exploited from the working class, will probably say no, they shouldn't, and that these people should have it taken off them. But they know very well that the tax system, whether it is administered by His Majesty's Revenue and Customs in Britain or whatever country you're in, is always going to be a system which is rigged against them. It's very rare that the rich individuals get audited or have their files pulled or examined. It's very rare that happens. So it's an interesting one. I hadn't considered the cigarette question for a while, but I know that the government's been using it as a sort of source of revenue because, of course, it's a burden that primarily falls on working class people for a long time now. So it's something that's certainly worth considering more. I think probably as part of a wider consideration of how communists should approach the tax question. We can always throw out there that in People's Korea, they did away with income tax 50 years ago, and they actually have a public holiday which celebrates the day that they did away with it. So perhaps we could start experimenting with the slogan, you only get zero income taxation under socialism, or socialism means representation and less taxation, maybe something like that. Right. Fenrir says France is the next Baltic Chihuahua. Good point. Where are we now? Eric Schmidt says, in one of Garland Nixon's programs with Scott Ritter, it wasn't 90,000 soldiers. A large part of the logistics was not completed. Ritter said that during a practice in 1989, everything was ready. So the actual staff that can focus on combat is much less, which is worrying. There seems to be the problem in the coordination. In Russian officer training, one college with only logistics. Andrei Martinov said they have a university education with only logistics, and many become engineer training as officers. Extremely high mathematical skills to mental calculation, artillery positions. Yeah, it's generally it seems to be that the Russian officer corps is far better trained than the European or American one. Not exactly a surprise. Bilbo1 says, are there any parties in the USA like CPGBML? Well, there's PC USA, but there's also other organizations that you can get involved with, such as the Chicago Workers' School, which you can find their site online. I'll try and call up the website for it now. Though if Comrade CJ is in the chat and he is able to provide the relevant reference. Yes, got it here. So I'm going to post that in the chat now. So there's other organisations you could certainly get involved with. I mean, the stage we're at now in Britain, like I always have to be honest when I'm talking to people about this. We're at the stage where we're at the beginning of a process here of trying to build communist influence in working class areas, trying an approach that hasn't really been tried before by most of the British left, who aren't interested in building any influence in working class areas. They're interested in building influence inside the trade union bureaucracy. So we're starting with small numbers, as you will be in the USA. Don't get the impression, if you're in America, that we're light years ahead of you, because we're not. We're starting from a similar situation, albeit you are, geographically speaking, operating on a bigger scale. And of course, you have probably a state with a much more violent history of anti-communism even than ours. But we face a similar problem, which is that serious building done by communists in working class areas in both Britain and the United States is this is both equally rare. So there are organisations to get involved with. Chicago Workers' School, PC USA being two of them. I know that there's some people who are involved with Caleb Maupin's project as well. So there are organisations going in the right direction out there in the USA. So check out those. Thomas says, Macron in the hot seat. Yeah, not handling it well either. Potted Rodent says, amateurs use tactics, professionals use logistics. I believe that is the quote. That's very true. Good evening to Todd out there in New Mexico, I believe. Fenrir says, next presidential election in France will be in 2027. I don't think Macron will last until then, honestly. The only reason he's still there is because he's retained until now the backing of the ruling class. Whether the ruling class decide that's enough now and it's time to make way for a perhaps more typically fascist regime, I don't know. But I can't see him lasting because they're going to need to go on the offensive against the domestic working class, and that's just going to explode the situation in France. And he's not got the political skills necessary to pull off the kind of victory that the ruling class needs there. They're going to need to bring in somebody else, which will further destabilize the situation. Where are we? Hello to Jenny. You've missed about 45 minutes or so, I would say. You can always catch up. Thomas says, the US wants to, or already is, using Russia's frozen assets to give it to Ukraine for its war efforts. Well, I mean, the money's going through Ukraine, as American politicians are fond of saying. Some of it will go to, of course, grease the wheels of the Kiev regime, keep things going there. But a lot of it will go straight back into the United States again, and into the pockets of European capitalists. Right. Cobra Commander says, topographical engineering is cool. It's permanently in my brain. When I walk around, I'm still pacing out measurements. Interesting thing. Since I started reading about military logistics planning, I've actually started doing a basic mathematics course in my spare time. Apparently Marx used to relax by doing mathematics problems. I failed mathematics at high school and had to retake it, and I've never been very good at it. So it's time to revisit it now. Right. Mark S says, much money to be made in our prison system. It's privatised and keeps people off the streets who otherwise don't have a job. Yes, you have still the prison slavery question over there. Lucas says, do you only see any possibility for socialism in the Latin countries in Europe, in particular France and Italy? I would say so. I know that France has suffered from the diminishing of the old French Communist Party, which had gone revisionist very early on. I know that Italy is suffering from the long-term after effects of the collapse of the old PCI, but the tradition remains in those countries. The problem is, of course, the lack of national organisations. There are national organisations, the lack of unified communist organisations, though some are working towards that. So I would say that the possibilities are there. Again, it very much depends upon how things evolve in the next period. But I wouldn't write off the possibility of us seeing positive moves in quite a number of European countries in the time to come. Now, none of this is automatic. There's going to be crises, but again, it depends upon how we respond to and the organisations we build to respond to those crises, and whether we can again root communism within the working class again in a way it hasn't been for years. So the opportunities do exist. It's just a question of whether we can respond to them. Is my response to that. I am happy to do more in-depth country profile work if people want me to. Which reminds me, I need to get the Germans back on again. Lertis says, domestically, Macron is a pure comprador and class warrior. Within foreign affairs, it's not much better, as he has sacrificed the modicum of diplomatic autonomy that still existed under Chirac. Yeah, Chirac was like the last of the Gaullists. After that, it's been all downhill in terms of the dreams of French autonomy from the United States. And I think that goes hand in hand with the decline of French capitalism, to be honest. Where are we now? Roberto G says, hello, is Vladislav Zubok's book about the collapse of the Soviet Union an accurate, trustworthy book on the subject? Well, I haven't read it, so I can't tell you. If anybody else in the chat has read it, be sure to answer Roberto's question. The books I've read on the collapse of the Soviet Union are there's Harpal Brau's book on the final collapse of revisionism, Kieran and Kenny on Socialism Betrayed, and the Ludo Martins book, The Velvet Counter-Revolution. So, where are we now? Raziel says, God forbid they put a tax on wealth and capital gains and close loopholes. Huh, why would they do that when the politicians themselves are exploiting all those loopholes? Vidnosh says, you need to buy the Dutch brand. They're called Van Anderen. They are tax-free. Anyway, smoking is bad for your health. Good points. Why don't do it anymore? Otis says, I believe cigars aren't going up in price. Interesting. Is pipe tobacco going up? I need to check that out. Albert says, of course they will ignore the big tax dodgers because they are rich bastards. These rich bastards are corporate donors to political parties. Well, it's class solidarity, Albert. They'll never go against their own class. Time to expropriate the Cayman Islands and Bermuda, says Raziel, and that's a good point. May the domestic population of the Cayman Islands and Bermuda rise up and expropriate all the wealth stored there. That'll make them some of the richest places on earth. Jenny says, I'm beyond pissed at the fake vaping illness, which was COVID, was used to heavily tax vape products. It used to be so much cheaper than nasty smoking, but the taxes are insane now. I thought big tobacco was behind it all back then, and they probably were, but they were really just distracting from the fact that the COVID started out of Fort Detrick in fall 2019. I've heard that. I heard that on Ryan Christian's program quite a while ago, that the vaping illness was actually COVID. Which is an interesting one. Someone asked me about this in the Telegram chat today, and I said I can't do much about looking into it now, but I will go into it in the future. As many of you may know, this podcast, the podcast that this show used to be, started in its audio form when myself and my former podcast partner Layla were looking at, or trying to look at, COVID from a Marxist perspective. Whether we succeeded in doing that or not, I don't know. I should go back and listen to those episodes again. Be interesting to see if I have any critiques of my old work. But I know that and we're going to come to this when we look at Sergei Shoigu's recent statement, the Chinese certainly treated it as, Chinese leadership treated it as a bioweapon attack. I've seen Pepe Escobar talk about that, and others as well, that the reason why the Chinese response became so severe was because they thought that basically the US was using a bioweapon on them. And if it was indeed leaked out of Fort Detrick, then that certainly makes sense, given that the Chinese would probably know where it came from. I always thought that the Americans trying to pin the blame on the leak out of the Chinese lab was a dodgy story, if anything, because the lab in Wuhan was something that was done in partnership with the United States. Now, were I Chinese, I would probably have a few questions for the CPC as to why they ever allowed the United States to operate a lab there in the first place, but that's another question for another day. Right. Arnold says, another way they make you pay, I've just had to pay £1,000 for dental treatment and I'm a pensioner. Bloody hell, mate. Jesus. Fucking robbing bastards. Vidnosh says, Cuba is in deep trouble. Are there any efforts underway to help? I haven't read about the latest problems. I read about some reactionary channels run about a massive hike in fuel payments. But yeah, I'll have to see about that. I'm not aware of the latest, whatever the latest problem is, I'm not sure. I'll have to look into it. Clinton asks, just wondering if the Revolutionary Communist Group UK, Stalinist or Trotskyist? RCG. Well, the new one, the new Revolutionary Communists, are the rebranded International Marxist Tendency, who trots that used to be the militant tendency. So they're rebranding to make themselves look like actual communists, where they're actually Trotskyites. Beju says, what do I think of Caleb Maupin's Centre of Political Innovation? I mean, some of the work he's done is very valuable. I still have certain disagreements with some of the perspectives that he puts forward, but seems to have done a decent job of bringing people towards a communist outlook. So it's certainly not something that I would be hostile to, even if I have a few disagreements on Maupin's perspectives on things. Otis says, no taxation without representation. This slogan makes me laugh. Well, let's reverse it. Representation and no taxation. Guaranteed basic income is a start. Well, it says Grassy Knoll, I don't necessarily agree with you there. I think that's another idea where, if tried under capitalism at this stage, would be turned into essentially a reactionary policy. I will explain. I'm happy to go into that more in a future episode. HM says, cigarettes are insanely expensive now. My elderly mother simply can't quit. Cigs and electricity is becoming a big problem. Yeah, basically the working class in all the imperialist countries now is getting their pockets emptied constantly. It's like an old cartoon of the capitalist picking up a worker by the ankles and shaking them until all the money falls out. Will the US try to stop the unravelling of its client states in Europe? I don't know whether they will try. I mean, there's certainly, the US still moves a lot of capital through Europe, and they still do a lot of trade with Europe. Whether they think that it's worth their while hanging on if the states in Europe start to crumble, that's another question. Given that the US may have bigger problems trying to assert itself in what it regards as its own hemisphere. One of the things that the European ruling classes are so terrified of is if the US does decide to pull the plug on NATO and walks away. That would leave the European ruling classes without a protector, and without a protector against the potential actions of their own working class. So, again, it's difficult to see what they could do if it all unravels at the same time. They couldn't do direct military occupation of all these countries in Europe. They could try and do some maneuvers behind the scenes to impose dictatorships in some of the bigger countries and hope that the rest fell into line. They may try doing that. But if things start falling apart in Europe, then the US ruling class may decide that, well, best take the hit and get out. We'll secure our control over our hemisphere and East Asia, and Europe can basically whistle for it. The US might make money in Europe, but of course the US ruling class has a lot of interest in many different places. They may decide that Europe's become a burden. I mean, certainly some of the US ruling class think that. That's who Trump speaks for. At the moment, the dominant faction in the US ruling class seems to be those who want to hang on to everything everywhere and not withdraw. So, or not withdraw from anywhere. That may change if the crisis in the US economy, which is there, very much there for the working class, gets worse and breaks out into the open, then we may see them have to recalculate. Right. Okay. I kind of lost track of the chat there for a second. So I'm going to go on to the next thing on the agenda, which is, of course, the Russian MOD briefing. Now, there's a couple of other things that I wanted to just highlight in this. I've already mentioned the speeding up of the Russian advance through various different areas. Now, this was confirmed by Minister of Defense Sergei Shoigu in a briefing he gave to the hierarchy of the Russian MOD. Now, I'm just going to post the link there to the English language page where you can see the briefing that Shoigu gave. The Russian Ministry of Defense briefing is where the entire Russian MOD hierarchy, so like all the political leadership, starting with Shoigu and the deputy ministers of defense, plus all the senior army, navy, and air force commanders come together, and they all give this massive briefing. And it's interesting to read the statements made by Shoigu in this, because he notes, first of all, that there's been a speeding up in the Russian advance, which we've covered already. He also says some interesting things on the number of troops lost by Ukraine. So he says, and this is a direct quote from the briefing, on average, since the beginning of the year, the enemy, that's Ukraine, has lost more than 800 troops and 120 units of various hardware, including foreign-made weaponry, every day. So that's 800 men a day killed and wounded. Excuse me. So that's quite the number that Shoigu's come out with there. So, of course, that flies in the face of Zelensky's claims about there being only 31,000 Ukrainian dead, which is just, even CNN had to push back on that one. Now, Shoigu goes on to say that the total number of, well, he says lost by Ukraine since the beginning of the special military operation has been 444,000 Ukrainians lost. Now, whether that is killed or killed and wounded, I'm not sure. I mean, the numbers that have been reported as to killed vary between 250 to 400,000. The Russian MOD number they're now going with is, I think that's total casualties, 444,000, so killed and wounded, which is a fucking huge number. That's more than the British Army lost in World War II, for instance. In fact, that's more than the British, French, and American armies lost in total in World War II. And Ukraine only had a population of 40 million tops when this thing began. So that's an astonishing number, but it's a number that's backed up by multiple sources now. So the other interesting things, Shoigu didn't just talk about Ukraine. He talked also about the fact that they have a security problem in the Central Asian region emanating partially from Afghanistan, which is not, of course, with the Taliban, with whom the Russian government has, well, decent relations, it would seem, but from groups that are identified as ISIS, our old friends. And Shoigu says, direct quote from him here, over the past year, the number of ISIS militants increased by 15%. So the question of ISIS in Afghanistan came up almost immediately. As soon as the US pulled out, it seemed that ISIS replaced them. And the role of the groups identified as ISIS is very curious. Now, Max Blumenthal accurately quotes John Kerry on this in his book, The Management of Savagery. And you can find a clip of Kerry saying things like this online. Well, Kerry said that they were happy to see the advance of ISIS in Syria in the hope that it would essentially pressure Assad to leave, to quit, to run away. So that's an admission that at the very least the US imperialists were happy to see ISIS come into existence and take territory in Syria. Now, there have been accusations over a number of years now that ISIS span out of Al-Qaeda in Iraq. And Al-Qaeda in Iraq was something which emerged out of a specific US plan. And that was a US plan to start a sectarian civil war in Iraq that would essentially derail the unified national resistance movement that was emerging in 2004, 5, 6. And so Al-Qaeda in Iraq emerging and starting to carry out massive, very deadly bomb attacks against the Shia population in Baghdad and in the south of Iraq. This was something that was very much in line with the US strategy at the time, which was divide the Iraqi national resistance movement along sectarian lines, cause them to have a civil war with each other, and that would take the heat off US forces. And that was what Al-Qaeda in Iraq was doing. And a lot of the guys who were later involved with ISIS, such as al-Baghdadi, came out of the prison system in Iraq that was run by the United States. And they all later went on to go through Al-Qaeda to form ISIS, which of course became this big thing about 10 years ago in Syria and also in Iraq. Now, of course, some will say, well, the US fought ISIS in Iraq. Well, that's true to an extent, because the thing known as ISIS got a bit out of control and threatened to overthrow their puppet regime in Iraq, which they weren't supposed to do. There's no guarantee that once you start these things, you can fully control them. And of course, the US-trained army, the US-trained Iraqi army, when it turned out to try and fight ISIS, collapsed instantly, and the senior officers ran away with briefcases full of money. So the question of who ISIS are and who they ultimately work for, I think is the question can be answered fairly definitively. They work for US imperialism. I doubt you'll find them on the payroll. Well, maybe you will when the US revolution seizes control of the Pentagon and manages to publish all the classified files in a series of books like the Iranians did that time. But the undeniable thing is that they operate in the interests of US imperialism. The only time they ever attacked the Israelis over the border from Syria, the ISIS fighters actually apologized to them. ISIS have never carried out any serious action against Israel and continue to operate in Syria only against the Syrian government. And periodically they'll attack the Kurds, but mostly it's the Syrian government they go after. So what does that tell you? And then they pop up in Afghanistan immediately after the American withdrawal and start carrying out attacks against the Taliban, who, you know, for all the fact that they are a deeply reactionary organization, are trying to form some kind of unified national government and trying to build relations with the Chinese, the Russians, and periodically and rather in a sort of disjointed fashion with the Iranians as well. So clearly, ISIS operates in the interests of US imperialism. The exact relationship will only be revealed with time. It's interesting that Shoigu noted that. So Shoigu's talking about the fact that they need to take action against that. He then goes into some very interesting details about the actions of the NGOs in Central Asia, which I think bears mentioning here. again, the direct quote from Shoigu's briefing. In addition, there are over 100 large pro-Western non-governmental organizations with more than 16,000 representative offices and branches operating in the region, he means Central Asia. Against the backdrop of the special military operation, these NGOs significantly increased their anti-Russian activities in order to reduce the military, technical, economic and cultural cooperation of the Central Asian states with the Russian Federation. We are taking proactive measures. This year, the Central Military District is to concentrate on resolving crisis situations in the countries of the region and participate in 7 exercises in the territories of Kazakhstan, Kyrgyzstan and Tajikistan. Combat training will culminate in the CSTO, that's the Collective Security Treaty Organization, Collective Rapid Reaction Force Interaction 2024 exercise, in which military contingents from 5 states will take part. Now, what he's talking about there, of course, is the fact that the Russian government has made the entirely correct decision that all these NGOs from the United States, Britain, France, Germany, Italy, Spain, that operate in the Central Asian regions, that this is imperialism at work. That they are building support for anti-Russian actions, colour revolutions, you name it, they're up to it. And it's taken the Russians a long time to finally take these actions and make this realization, but now they have. And you see recently, I believe it was in Kyrgyzstan, which is a country that is, of course, member of the CIS, member of the Eurasian Economic Union. They're starting to take action, restricting the activities of NGOs now. I think the big one that Shoigu and the Russians are concerned about more than any other is probably Kazakhstan. And that's because, of course, the Kazakh government, both under Tokayev and his predecessor, the former president Nazarbayev, who Tokayev got rid of in a sort of, shall we say, operation conducted jointly with the Russians immediately before the special military operation began. Now, Tokayev takes, of course, tries to sort of ride both horses here. On the one hand, he wants to keep the very extensive economic relationship that they have with the Russians. On the other, British imperialism in particular has carried out a long-term operation in Kazakhstan to try and win influence there and, of course, make profits there off Kazakh gas and oil reserves. And under Nazarbayev, Tony Blair, that wretched criminal, was very active in Kazakhstan. So clearly there's a game afoot in Kazakhstan, and the fact that Tokayev leans one way, Len leans the other, is clearly a concern to the Russians, and they're putting the blame down to some of this on like the political activities of the NGOs in the region. So it's interesting that Shoigu in a Ministry of Defense briefing is identifying the NGOs in Central Asia as a problem. And of course the governments that are closest to the Russians, like the Kyrgyz government, are now starting to restrict their activities. And this of course brought forth an immediate whining from Antony Blinken, because he understands very well that these NGOs operate as arms of the US state or the British state, and they are essentially intelligence agencies in charity form. So it's interesting that Shoigu's reflecting upon that. Final point I wanted to pick up from Shoigu's briefing here was the fact that he concludes his remarks here by stating some facts about what he says is the activity plan of the Directorate of the Nuclear, Chemical and Biological Protection Troops of the Armed Forces of the Russian Federation. Now I'll quote again from his briefing note here as follows. Today, threats of a radiological, chemical and biological nature are provoked by the actions of Washington. Washington is building up nuclear capabilities on the territory of European countries, that means us by the way, and is deploying advanced means of nuclear delivery. In addition, the USA has formed a network of biolaboratories to study the properties of region-specific pathogens that can be transmitted to humans and cause pandemics. About 40 out of the 330 such facilities are located in Ukraine. Now, this has been said before, but again, interesting that this is a key part of Shoigu's briefing, that the Russians, again, and together with the Chinese, regard the threat from the large network of biological warfare laboratories that the US maintains in a lot of countries that surround Russia and China as part of the US's bio-war programs. And that links back to what I believe Jenny was saying earlier about COVID probably being having its origins in Fort Detrick and leaking out of there somehow. And the Russians now regard the biolab system as a key national security threat to themselves, and that the US has been experimenting, as Shoigu says, with pathogens that are designed to specifically target certain regions. There's been stories going around. I remember Last American Vagabond, Ryan Christian covered this quite a long time ago. He'd been covering stories about how the US was experimenting with various different pathogens that would only affect Slavs. Now, I think that's like crazy shit straight out of like some sort of Nazi scientist's wet dream. But I do believe that the US has been doing it. Certainly, it's the kind of crazy stuff that that bio warfare has been tailored towards in the past. So, or that the other one was that they were experimenting with pathogens that would, or various different viruses and various different pests that would cause like massive crop failures in Russia and China and other places. So it's clear that the Russians and the Chinese fully expect, this is in their internal briefings to their own armed forces, that the US is going to try some kind of biological warfare, or threaten to try unleash some kind of biological warfare capability upon them. And I think this must lead us to reflect upon something, which is that as as US imperialism goes down, which it is, given that we know now, thanks to the fact that not only have the Russians revealed the existence of the biological warfare laboratories in Ukraine, Victoria Nuland also revealed them, probably getting out ahead of the story. And we know that they've got these facilities in places like Armenia, which is run by compradors. And they're present in Kazakhstan as well, which goes back to the dubious role played by Kazakhstan and the influence of imperialism there. And as US imperialism starts to degenerate and go down, and particularly if this collapse comes quite quickly, which I don't necessarily think it will, but if US imperialism is hurtling towards a very, very public defeat and towards potential disaster, then the question has to be asked, are there factions inside the US state machine which would just pull the trigger on some kind of biological warfare event like this? It's a legitimate question to ask, given that if you remember back in the 90s, I mean, I remember the post-Soviet world where there wasn't a day that went by at some point in the mid-90s where if you didn't get a news story or a sort of media panic or a film coming out about rogue ex-Soviet scientists unleashing pathogens, or rogue former nuclear scientists selling nukes to terrorists and stuff like that. Well, what if all of that was ultimately an act of projection? What if the real danger to the world is a decaying US empire, which, when faced with potential economic oblivion and being publicly and disastrously defeated in Ukraine, decides to pull the trigger on some kind of biological warfare episode? It's a point that's worth considering. If the Chinese government does believe, and I think it's clear now that they do, that COVID was a constructed virus that was released upon them deliberately. Again, I remember the coverage about this from years ago, that this was released in the middle of 2019. And I remember that there was a story of how COVID was found to be present in samples taken from the sewage system, I believe in a city in Spain, in samples taken in the middle of 2019. So it had been floating around the world since at least early to mid 2019 before it was officially declared. And the idea being that this was somehow transported to China, and the idea was, if this seems to be the way the Chinese government views it, the pandemic was a setup on them to try and cause an internal crisis in China. In the end, the Chinese system proved far more durable, and COVID actually produced a far more systemic crisis of legitimacy and authority in the West, including in the United States. So if that was a gamble, it didn't work out very well. But we should take this seriously, given that this is something which the governments in China and Russia are taking seriously. Now, as to what we can do about that, we can only continue our political work in building our organizations and getting ready for potential revolts to come. But be aware of the kind of people who run the imperialist system don't give two shits whether tens of millions of people live or die. Remember the line from The Third Man, if any of you have seen that film, where Orson Welles, who's the sort of anti-hero or villain actually of the piece, called Harry Lime, is talking to the Joseph Cotten character, his old friend from childhood, and they're in this big wheel going around the fairground in Vienna, and they're going up to the top, and the Harry Lime character, played by Orson Welles, is giving this speech, and he points down to people moving on the ground and says, would you really care that much if any of those dots down there, meaning the people, just stopped moving forever? And it's a great little piece of writing. It was a monologue written by Orson Welles himself, and that's how the bourgeois view things. If 10 million dots, as they would see it, stopped moving forever, if releasing some hideous developed pathogen on an area of the world helps them to stave off collapse, or at least damage their enemies on the way as they're on the way down, there's people inside the US system that would do that. There's people inside the British system that would do that. Never underestimate the barbarity of the people that we're up against. And these are the people who live in our countries, who control our governments. They don't care whether the people here live or die, or whether people overseas live or die. To them, our lives are as cheap and expendable as ants, as Harry Lime says. Would you care if any of those dots stop moving forever? And that's how they view things. Right. Okay. The other thing I wanted to mention tonight was, of course, the massive, shall we say, failures in analysis, or perhaps the inevitable failures in analysis, of a certain Dr. Cornel West. The trigger event for this was, of course, the strange death of Alexei Navalny, killed by somebody, who knows who. Well, probably killed by the British, I would suspect, if the stories about his potential prison swap with the Americans are in any way true. Now, the question of why Cornel West decided to go onto Twitter and compare Navalny to Leonard Peltier and Mumaya Abu-Jamal is a curious one, because, of course, Navalny has a track record of being he's been a Russian liberal, he's been a Russian fascist, he's been various different things that his CIA handlers demanded of him. But why on earth would Cornel West, who poses as this great figure of the Black Liberation Movement in the United States, be endorsing a man who referred to people from the Caucasus as insects, who referred to all the non-white elements of Russia as inferior, and whether this was sincerely meant or not, whether it was just messaging he was giving out there on behalf of his handlers, who knows? Why on earth would West compare him to anti-imperialist fighters like Mumaya Abu-Jamal or Leonard Peltier? And the answer, of course, lies in the very dubious, non-materialist politics of Cornel West. Cornel West comes less, I would say, from the sort of black revolutionary tradition and more from the American New Left tradition, which ceased to do, of course, any kind of materialist analysis a long time ago. It became overtly anti-Marxist, and during the Cold War became an anti-communist left, as many others have pointed out, including people like Gabriel Rockhill. Now, West is of a similar kind of piece to someone like Chris Hedges, who talk this big game, but when you actually get down to it, what is their politics based on? West's politics are based on what I would describe as abstract moralizing. And that's why Cornel West can praise Ronald Reagan as a great freedom fighter for Soviet Jews, as he did when Reagan died in 2011. The tweet's still up there if you want to go and inspect it. And what the new left ended up being in the United States and in Britain was this anti-communist left vehicle that started condemning workers' states and socialist states as just being as oppressive as capitalist states, or even worse. And this was something that both the petty bourgeois left and the Trotskyites took up to ever-increasing volumes. And West perfectly represents that. To someone like him, he would say that he's against all oppression, or he's against imprisoning people for their political beliefs. Well, of course, a communist would answer, or should answer, that, well, whether a prison is bad or not rather depends upon which class controls the state and who you lock up in it. So if you're locking up people like Banderists or Baltic fascists or counter-revolutionaries who murder workers and sabotage the development of socialism in a country, then a prison is a good thing. If you're locking up somebody like Alexei Navalny, who, if he'd have managed to get himself into power, would have destroyed Russia and turned it into what Ukraine has been turned into now, then actually that's a pretty good thing. Saying, well, locking up political opponents is wrong rather depends upon the nature of the political opponent. What class do they serve? Are they a tool of imperialism? But of course, the abstract moralizing of the new left never covered those issues. Same is true even for people whose work I've admired in the past, such as the late great journalist John Pilger. John Pilger, in one of his books, which contains a lot of useful information, Hidden Agendas, starts ranting and raving at various points about the dreadful oppression inflicted upon the protesters at Tiananmen by the Chinese regime. He starts going on about how evil the Bulgarian communist regime was under Todor Zivkov. Well, look at the effects of post-communism and capitalist restoration on Bulgaria, John, if you could, and see how that worked out. And of course, Pilger worked with the Czechoslovak anti-communist organization, headed by Václav Havel, which was, of course, supported by US imperialism. Now, a lot of these people, even the more decent ones like Pilger, who retained, his principles up to the end of his life, what they dealt with was, again, none of these people were Marxists. A lot of them became anti-communists because, or at least useful additions to the anti-communists, because they saw things in these abstract moral terms, divorced from concrete material analysis, which is, of course, as others have pointed out, exactly how the Second International lot and Karl Kautsky ended up. Karl Kautsky ended up condemning the Bolshevik Revolution and defending what he called democracy. Again, Kautsky's approach to what he called democracy was completely abstract. He'd abstracted the democracy as a value away from class. Kautsky had ended up defending bourgeois democracy and the bourgeois state on the grounds that it had afforded the German working class a certain degree of democratic concessions. But what he completely failed to take into account and refused to take into account was the different ways in which democracy looked under different forms of class rule. Soviet democracy is an entirely different and much more thorough democratic system than, of course, the bourgeois democracy. Even the most democratic expressions of bourgeois democracy are outclassed by Soviet democracy, which Kautsky resolutely refused to see because, of course, he had become an opportunist who benefited from the continued existence of German imperialism. And that is the sad truth about people like Cornel West. These people are new left social democrats who are anti-communist and who hide their anti-communism behind abstract expressions of generic principles like oppression is wrong, or we fight for freedom of conscience, and all stuff like that, which all to the ears of people who are coming into politics for the first time might sound really progressive. But again, do the material analysis. Who's locked up in a Soviet prison? Who are these prisoners of conscience? What was the act of conscience, apparently, that they were imprisoned for? Was it blowing up a school? Was it burning down a factory? Was it being a member of a fascist organization? You can't detract, you can't remove that from the question of why these people were imprisoned in the first place. And the fact that Cornel West was happy to endorse Navalny, and I think he knew very well who Navalny was, by the way. I don't think it was a question of ignorance. I think he knew who Navalny was. He was endorsing Navalny for the same reason he endorsed all the anti-communist shit back in the day. Because fundamentally, Cornel West, for all his protestations of pacifism, is as much of a social chauvinist as his friends in the DSA and the CPUSA are. That's who the American left is. It's also who the British left is. Hidden behind the declarations of pacifism and woolly declarations of universal values and other such crap lies the same old thing, the same old crap, social chauvinism and social imperialism, dressed up in prettifying Christian language. Right. I will now pause for further questions from the floor. Right, where are we? A lot of people got things to say. Okay. Hello to Tusker, who's joined us. Good to have you with us. Right, where are we now? 2,000 subscribers by midnight. Hopefully so, Morgan. Be sure to like and share this if you haven't done so already. And Morgan says, the Americans' fight against ISIS was focused on levelling towns and cities along the Euphrates in order to ensure the Syrians couldn't claim back their resources north of the river. Good point. They massacred thousands of civilians. Also a good point. Right. Otis says, I remember GoldenEye chemical weapons hidden in a damn valley. Bilbo says it was a test run. Chimera coronavirus research had been going on for decades, but in 2015 it was all classified. Morgan says retrospective American Red Cross blood sample testing from mid-December 2019 showed 1.5% of Americans who donated blood over a 2-week period had developed an immunity to COVID. Interesting. Tim Gray says brilliant lighting in The Third Man, a classic I use in my teaching on cinematography. Classic film, really is. Brilliant film. Directed by Carol Reed, I believe. Bilbo says population control leaders believe if they reduce population, they will be able to control the planet easier. They've always believed that. I mean, this comes back to the program we did a few weeks ago on Malthusianism. There's always been segments of the ruling class who want to severely cut down on the population. Of course, they can't actually do it because, again, without a continually expanding labour pool, there is no capitalism, there is no profit. So they're always stuck. Jenny says, Cornel West doesn't need anyone else to destroy him. He's perfectly capable of destroying himself. That's very true. Matthew said there's a biolab run by the US Army in Georgia as well. Yeah, and in a lot of the other ex-Soviet countries who are run by compradors. It's one of the big things the US demands of you, to use your population as lab rats. Cornel West is embarrassing, says Potted Rodent. Well, that's certainly true. Lurtis says West's lashing out at the revolutionary blackout network folk was cringe. Yeah, like, really bizarre. But then again, it's good. I mean, he's revealed himself for what he is, which is a anti-communist reactionary fraud, which is what he's always been. Pittsburgh Dude 87 says, besides the rather ridiculous comparisons to Mumaya and Peltier, West also compared Navalny to the Nobel Prize-winning Iranian regime change agent, which was perhaps unintentionally apt on his part. Jesus Christ. Lorg66 says Cornell comes from the Edwardian English nationalist imperialist tradition. He's a suck-up. Yep. Pittsburgh dude says West's wife is Iranian and supported the women's protests in Iran. He also talks about Chinese Uyghurs being supposedly oppressed. He also seems to generally support liberal imperialist narratives. Yeah, the oppression of the Uyghurs, the genocide that turned into a genocide of culture. I mean, the fact that he supports that just says, like, he's on the same level as the Beastie Boys and their Free Tibet concerts. Christopher Hitchens, what happened to him? Well, he remained the same as he always did. Like, he was always a rabid anti-communist. He just became more openly reactionary as time went on, but he was always a reactionary. I know I grew up in my teenage years thinking he was something special because he knew a lot of big words, but in reality he was a cheap reactionary and always was. Darth Radio says, as a Bulgarian communist, I'd like to add a few things about Todor Zivkov. Yes, the fall of socialism in my homeland brought tremendous hardships for my compatriots, but our late Communist Party's leadership made some serious mistakes in the 1980s. I can list, for example, the so-called revival process, i.e. the forced assimilation of Bulgarian Muslims. Well, yeah, that's a good point. For all the disasters that followed, we should always be clear-eyed in our analysis of the mistakes that led to the collapse. Otis says Jimmy Dore had a very heated debate with Cornel West on his show. Yeah, that was very embarrassing for Cornel West mainly, who revealed himself as very clueless. Right, where are we now? Darth Radius adds, as a conclusion to my previous comments, in other words, Bulgarian socialism was not without its faults, and crushing all dissent regardless of class affiliation is not a useful strategy. We must really come back to Bulgarian socialism at some point. Galloway has won, apparently. Well, that's interesting. I expected as much. I mean, the Labour Party did everything possible to give him the seat, and he's riding the wave of the Gaza protest. So, well, if he's back in, let's see what he does with it. I imagine we've got a general election in this country within the next 6 to 8 months, so the Labour Party will throw everything at winning that seat back off him. Let's see if he's able to build anything. Reason why I remain sceptical of Mr. Galloway is because I've seen projects that he has been involved with before, even when he's got back into Parliament as an independent, which he has done twice before, in 2005 and 2012. On both occasions, the organisation he was a part of failed to build anything serious. So I remain sceptical as to whether Mr. Galloway is capable of building anything now. Let's see. Maybe he'll do something with it. Maybe he'll prove me wrong in my doubts upon this point. But I am and remain of the opinion that Galloway's principal interest is in Galloway. And I don't think he's particularly interested in building out a broader party. I think he's interested in getting back into Parliament. And once he's in Parliament, then he'll get on TV more. Yeah, he'll say some things which are very true. But again, I don't think he's going to build anything out of this. If I'm wrong, I'll be back on here and I'll be addressing it. But I think it's going to go much like his previous experiments with Respects did back in the 2000s. And it's going to lead to Galloway being on TV more, and that's about it. Zweibacher says, what's the CPG-BML's position on China, if they're socialist or not? Bra's book suggests no. Other articles pointing in the direction. Is there a consensus? Yeah, the consensus is in the book. I mean, the way that the party sees this is that the achievements of the Chinese Revolution must be respected. China must be defended against imperialist aggression. But it's the leadership's been firmly on the capitalist road now for over 40 years. Again, like, we defend the achievements of China. We recognise that it's made many great achievements. It's achieved many great things. But there is still a capitalist class in China, and there are still problems, significant problems created by that, which admittedly, the Xi Jinping leadership now has seen that it is creating problems and is taking measures to remedy that. But that's the basic position of the party. I think what you're referring to is that the party recognises that it's a mixed picture in terms of the fact that it's not just gone capitalist and gone, like Russia in the 90s, gone comprador. The capitalist class is still constrained by the Communist Party of China and by its leadership, but it's still the capitalist mode of production being present within China creates certain problems, which again the leadership has actually admitted to and is trying to resolve them. But we'll have to see how this process plays out. That's my very short rundown of the situation there. But in broadly speaking, even though China entered onto the capitalist road in the Deng Xiaoping era, we continue to defend China and to continue to defend the Communist Party of China for all their historic and current achievements. Right. Okay. So that brings us to the close of play for tonight. We've got 108 of you watching live right now, which is excellent. Again, be sure to like and share the stream if you haven't done so already. I will be back again tomorrow, and tomorrow night what we're going to be doing is an analysis of the quite lengthy speech that Putin gave earlier today to the Federal Assembly of the Russian Federation. There's a very considerable amount of information in there that I need to read through and talk through tomorrow. So the live stream tomorrow, same time again, 10 p.m. Come and join me then to go through the Putin speech. So thanks to everybody who's contributed to to what is a very active chat this evening. All good stuff. And I will be throwing you back now to your usual musical outro.
Never